Do you want to learn how to do free motion quilting on your sewing machine? Let me show you how to get started using the Brother NV180. As a sewing beginner, we sometimes get confused with so many tips and tutorials online. And I'm glad to introduce you to our newest sewing video series featuring the easiest tips and tricks that I wish I learned when I started sewing. It's Julius again from Sew It's Your Style, and welcome to Sewing Saturday, where we teach you how to become a better sewer. From tips and tricks, all the way to making your very first project. Join us today as we explore the basics of sewing. Quilting. It's one of those long-term projects that really requires time and effort. But what are quilts really are? A quilt is a multi-layered textile made up of 2 or 3 layers of fabric or fiber. The top fabric, the batting in the middle, and a backing fabric underneath. They're often shaped as blankets, a comforter, or a duvet, and are usually made from an insulation material called batting. But what usually people are mistaken for is the process of quilting. A quilt cannot be called a quilt without the process of joining the 3 layers of fabric by sewing. Quilting actually is the stitches made by sewing down the layers of fabric. This can be done either by hand, which is the traditional way of making quilts, a specialized long-arm quilting machine, or a domestic sewing machine. And often, people think that it is really difficult to quilt on a sewing machine due to the limited arm space that these machines have. So most likely, sewers will assemble and finish the top of the quilt, and they will send it off to a long-arm quilter to finish the job. Only for simple reasons such as they don't know how to quilt on their sewing machines, and they aren't confident enough to quilt on their own, and risk ruining the quilt top that they have worked on for so long. That is why today I will be demonstrating how to quilt on the Brother NV180, the sewing, embroidery, and quilting machine. At the beginning of this video, I have mentioned the words free motion quilting. And what is it all about? Now, quilting, like I said, can be done either by hand or by machines. Of course, it will be manageable to quilt by hand, but it will probably take some time to finish off a quilt. Quilting on domestic sewing machines is easier and gives you the liberty to be more creative. You can quilt 2 ways on the Brother NV180. First is by using a walking foot, which tends to be easier. A walking foot is a specialized foot with a stem or a guide used for sewing straight lines. This can be used if your aim is to quilt faster using equally spaced sewing stitches. The second option is to do free motion quilting. As the word implies, instead of the machine controlling the fabric and stitching, it is you who will control the fabric and the stitching freely. And this will enable you to incorporate any quilting designs instead of just using straight stitches. Before we begin the process of quilting, first we must prep our fabric. We will need a top layer, a batting layer, and a backing fabric. The top layer is usually elaborate and consisted of fabric pieces that are sewn together to create a design, such as this quilt. The batting layer is a puffy material, usually made with polyester, cotton, or a combination of both, and sometimes fleece. It's what makes the quilt soft and warm. The last layer, which is the backing fabric, is usually a plain wide piece of fabric used to secure the back. I will be working on this piece of fabric to demonstrate how you can use the NV180's free motion quilting feature. I will begin by placing the backing fabric wrong side up. This is so that when the quilt is finished, the back side of the quilt shows the right side of the backing fabric and not the wrong side. I will then place the batting fabric on top of the backing fabric. And lastly, the top, which is often where all the designs is incorporated into. You will notice that the layers differ in sizes. The backing is always 3 to 4 inches larger than the batting, and the batting is 3 to 4 inches larger than the top. This is because the quilt will shrink once I start incorporating all the quilting stitches in it. This process is called creating a quilt sandwich. Once all the layers are placed, I will secure the quilt sandwich with safety pins. This is to ensure that the layers doesn't shift during the process. Once the quilt sandwich is prepared, I will then set up my sewing machine, the NV180, to free motion quilting. First is to install a quilting needle. Needle sizes can vary, but a size 90/40 needle is often used. Next is to thread the machine using a cotton thread. Cotton thread is the most commonly used type of thread in quilting, as it provides a distinct texture and a non-reflective finish that allows it to blend into the fabric better. And also, it will not cause the quilt to pucker when used or washed. Then I will attach the free motion quilting foot. This foot comes standard in embroidery machines such as the NV180, as they can be both used for quilting and embroidering. It has a spring mechanism which raises and lowers with the action of the needle up and down. Then the most important step in free motion quilting is lowering the feed dogs off the sewing machine. This is done by sliding the feed dog switch to the left, located at the rear end of the machine base. For the stitch selection, the default straight stitch is often used when quilting. Lastly, plugging in the foot controller, as this will enable me to gain control of the sewing speed. Now once everything is set up, I will begin the process of free motion quilting on the NV180. Usually, quilting begins on one corner of the quilt, which means I will be starting from one corner and work my way up, filling the entire quilt with stitch designs. The first quilting design I will show you is the easiest for beginners. Start by anchoring your first stitch onto the quilt by making few stitches without moving the quilt. This is called the stipple stitch. This is done by firmly holding the fabric with both hands against the bed of the machine and slowly moving it in a wave-like motion without touching the previous lines of stitching. This is done randomly, and the goal is to fill the spaces of the quilt top evenly. This design will resemble pieces from a jigsaw puzzle. The key is to practice control in moving the quilt sandwich in a consistent manner, as well as by controlling the foot pedal on a moderate speed. Also, the stipple is a good way to get started on free motion quilting, as it doesn't have to be perfect in size. Fill in the entire space evenly until the entire quilt top is sewn or stitched. You can come up with creative designs such as these long wavy lines or paisleys. This process of quilting secures all the three layers together for the quilt to become usable. With free motion quilting, controlling the movement of the fabric to match the sewing speed is important, as the needle may break if the fabric is moved faster than the sewing speed. So practice is key in quilting. Once you become confident enough with the free motion quilting, you can then start stitching other quilting designs into your quilt top. The Brother NV180 never disappoints in any of its sewing feature. It is filled with so much sewing applications that can help you get better in sewing. I hope that you loved today's free motion quilting tutorial, and I will see you in the next episode of Sewing Saturday.